We are now being recorded.
Great. Thank you everyone for coming to our monthly breakfast for dispute resolvers. Until last April, we were meeting in person at John Jay since 9/11. Today is our 236th monthly breakfast. These breakfasts are now recorded and posted online. They are currently all available at www.ACR-GNY. Feel free to access these at any time on demand. I'm Maria Volpe. I'm a professor at John Jay College and director of the Dispute Resolution Program. These breakfasts are co-sponsored each month by the City University of New York Dispute Resolution Center at John Jay College and the Association for Conflict Resolution of Greater New York. As I said, this is our 20th year now doing these breakfasts. So and each month we're so
tooth in the back. It's sometimes when I bite down, it doesn't I don't hit the ceiling.
Hello. Good. Thank you, Nikki.
Thank you. We're so excited to see everyone and that we now in this virtual environment can have speakers from literally anywhere. In the past, we did have our colleagues from around the world.
Oh, you're muted, Maria. Maria, muted.
Someone, I think, muted me when we
that was me. I was trying to let someone in and the name popped. Sorry.
Yeah, not unusual that happens when we're letting people in. In the past, we were always delighted when we could have our colleagues from around the world join us as speakers and participants, but they had to be in New York. So just before we got started, we were talking about our future. We sort of don't know right now. We've been told that we will be teaching in person, but it is going to be a very slow reopening process. Things change almost on a daily basis. And since they announced that people who are 16 and older can be vaccinated as of April 6th in New York, it's possible that things could change dramatically, and next month we'll have a very different reading on our reopening process. For this breakfast, we're going to encourage people to use the chat to raise any questions, concerns, thoughts, and we will share them with Tom during the course of the session. There are 4 of us on this call at the moment who will be watching for any potential disruptions. It's the kind of thing that we do these days. If there are any Zoom bombings or chat bombings, we will remove the person from our session. We are committed to trying to have as respectful a session as we can. These breakfasts are organized and facilitated each month by a wonderful committee, including Julie Denny, Chuck Newman, Matthew Latimer, and Nikki Borofsky. I said 4 of us are on the call. Unfortunately, Matthew, who works for the Department of Justice, is on assignment today.
You're muted.
I'm sorry, Maria, I did it again.
And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Julie, who is going to introduce Tom, who's been with us almost since the beginning, and it's terrific to have you with us as a presenter here this morning, Tom. Julie?
Yeah, Tom is calling in from California, for heaven's sakes.
Can you get a little closer to your speaker?
Yeah, I am having problems. Can you hear me now? I will speak very loudly and very clearly. Anyway, Tom is in California, which if you do the math means that it's 5:36 his time. Bless your heart, Tom. Tom has been with us since forever. He's worked at the intersection of facilitation, mediation, and conflict resolution for the last 20 years with a focus on support for organizations. He helps them work through conflict and uncertainty to find a common unity, a community of wholeness, purpose, and direction. His work includes approaches emphasizing deep listening, approaches which he developed personally, informed by his experience and outlook as a Quaker, and his training in mediation and conflict resolution, not to mention his 50 years of experience as a lawyer in public service for the poor and in private practice. Tom works with secular as well as faith-based organizations. Tom, welcome and take it away.
Thank you, Julie, for that lovely introduction. And it's great to be back home in New York, even if virtually, for this breakfast. And I'm looking forward to it, and I hope everyone will find it worthwhile. I do want to say a couple of things. First of all, you don't want to just look at my lovely face, so I am going to share my screen so that you have something else to look at besides me. And so this program is, I've titled it, Finding the Highest Common Denominator. And I hope you find it worthwhile. I've enjoyed, if you've got half the people and then you add one to that, you've decided. But what happens to the whole society when a half plus one is enough? That creates a duality. It's us who were for and them who were against, or us who were against and them who were for but had one more person than we did. So it's a quick decision, but how easy is it to carry out? And we see that playing out in society at large. And if we have a decision by plurality, it becomes even muddier because it may be a minority that makes the decision. So choosing the option with the most votes, even if it's a minority, may be fine for decisions like, what color shall we paint the kitchen floor? Well, we paint it green because that got the most votes this week. But you know, if people change their minds, it's not a big deal to change the kitchen floor. But what happens with important decisions, with long-term effects, when we do it that way? We call all the groups around and call people, and you know, the most people want the hospital to be built here or the road to run there. But that, you can't change that so quickly if people's minds change. So there are long-term effects. And then you have the supermajority. So then you're pretty sure, if you get to the supermajority, that you've really got the people behind you. But that also leads to the tyranny of the minority, because a large group, even though it's less than the majority, can stop anything from happening. And you know, we don't have to think about where that is these days. So then that leads to a couple of other ways of deciding that depend on everybody coming together one way or another. So first we have a decision by consensus, which I call the lowest common denominator. And why? Because when you go around the room and you say, how about this? If somebody says no, well, you don't have unity, so you discard that option. And then you look at it and you keep continuing that process until, in effect, you come to something where nobody is unhappy. And you say, okay, that's our decision. We're going to do this because everybody said that was okay. Sometimes that works, but it can also lead to a decision where there's no energy for it, no enthusiasm for it. It may take longer to get to consensus than a majority, but you can still lack energy and enthusiasm. So the last on this list is a decision based on unity. And that's a decision that takes much longer to reach. And that's finding a solution where everybody says, yes, I want that. And if somebody suggests something different, we see how that can support what's being proposed. And we build upwards rather than collapsing downwards. So then when you get there, you've got something that will be actively supported by the whole group from the moment of saying yes. So I've been trying to think about how to describe that in effect. So let's talk about just, let's say all voices combined, which makes me think of amateur musicians, happening to be one myself. So if you're trying to find something that you want to sing in this group, and you use a consensus process, well, I don't like that song. This one's too complicated for me. That one's in German, I can't sing in German. And you end up maybe singing Row, Row, Row Your Boat because everything else has been rejected. So, I mean, this is exaggerated. Maybe it's another April Fool's joke, I don't know. But that's what you can end up with, is the equivalent of row, row, row your boat. But if you say, well, I don't like this, I like that one, and somebody else says, well, that's very complicated, and you say, well, we can break it down into pieces. And so you find ways to put it together, to build it together, and take all the positive elements, and you may end up singing a Bach fugue, which is a very different creature. So that's just kind of one way of and illustrating it. So let's say more about this and how we get there. So this is from the perspective of participants. It's reaching for the best in what each person brings, listening actively for what's best and most positive in the other person's contribution. It's affirming one another and then bringing everyone's best into a single outcome, a single goal. So you have to have trust, mutual trust and respect. And the facilitator has to support this, not by supporting one way or another, but with curiosity, with asking rather than telling. And so here is the Quaker inspiration for this. I said this was Quaker inspired. It's not just for Quakers, but it is Quaker inspired. And so I'm going back here to look at a real description of a Quaker approach to decision making. And this is from an actual group of Quakers called Lake Erie Yearly Meeting. It's probably the best short description I've seen of the Quaker decision-making process. And I'll let you read the whole, but I want to emphasize Friends place a high value on unity, what we've been talking about. And so we wait until we can agree on the decision before moving ahead. And that can feel very exasperating. But then once we get there, we can go quickly. So here's a Quaker view of majority rule. So you have to go from here to here. I don't know if you see my mouse on the screen. Yeah, okay. So we go from here to here, and it takes a while to get there, but once we've gotten there, we only have half the group with us. And so it's still a long way to implementation. And the losers feel defeated. They may resist. They may even sabotage the policy or the implementation of it that results from the decision. Here's the other choice. When everybody consents to the decision, it may take a lot longer to get there. Now you have to get all the way across to here. But once you get to that place, everyone feels ownership of the process and of the decision. And there isn't a disgruntled minority left because everyone has agreed. And so the implementation happens immediately. So this is a real Quaker text from Lake Erie Yearly Meeting. There's a link at the bottom. I haven't changed their language except to emphasize certain elements of it. So that's the inspiration and how to bring that to other organizations. But I do want to share it at this point, a story, and it's actually my wife's story. When she was not a Quaker, but she was at a sewing circle with some Quaker women. And she said, you know, this process, I don't understand it. It takes so long to make a decision. And one of her friends said, yes, but it's the process that's important. Because in this process, we build community. And when you're working with organizations in conflict, that's what you want to do. You want to build community to bring the organization back. So just to emphasize this again, here are the two depictions together. Majority rule, quick decision, but impeded implementation. But when you work on the basis of unity, it's a slower decision, but it's a united implementation.
Tom,
And,
there
yeah.
are a couple of questions. Do you want to?
Yes, I was about to say maybe there are some questions now.
Okay, one is, what do you do when you have one real obstructionist who is not satisfied with anything unless it's his idea? And another related one is, what if you have all but one person? Does that constitute unity?
Okay. There is a distinction between unity and unanimity. So if you have one person who is simply being an obstructionist and just is going to say no, no matter what, at a certain point, the group may have to say, you know what, you're not with us, but we have to move ahead. And that does happen in Quaker process among friends. It's pretty rare. Typically, the person who is saying no at a certain point will recognize that that's where the group is and will say, is part of the formal process, I stand aside. I can't join with this decision, but I recognize that it's where the group is. And so that way you preserve the community, but you're also able to move aside. The other side of that, which is very important, is sometimes the one person is the voice of conscience, and they say, I can't stand aside. And I've seen that happen. And that can be very, very powerful. I won't tell too much of a story about it, but I did see that happen one time where my meeting, Brooklyn meeting, I'm now in a meeting in California, but my meeting was considering taking a stand on something. And there was one person who said, no, this is not in accordance with science. It's, you know, it's an overblown position. And that was when the meeting was about to approve this policy statement. And it was sent back and it was considered further, and everybody did more research. And in the end, the meeting said, you know what? You're right. We should not adopt this position. And that was very affirming for the meeting. And by the way, turned out to be prescient also, because with further research, it turned out that the scientific claims about it, which had to do with a vaccine, were wrong. And there were other religious bodies that had taken a stand on it. And we avoided getting caught in that trap because of the voice of conscience. So that's a lot to say about that question, but that is an important question. So there are ways of getting to unity. And sometimes you do have to say, well, you know, we understand that you're not with us, but this really is the decision of the organization of the group.
Thanks.
So now we come to one of my mantras that also relates to finding the place of unity. And this is this couplet by Robert Frost. We, the group, we dance round in a ring and suppose, but the secret sits in the middle and knows. So how do we help that secret to reveal itself to us? How do we reach in to the center and touch the secret as we dance around searching for it? So let's lay some groundwork for that. So we're seeing the organization here as a community. That's a very important part of my work. And again, that comes from this Quaker perspective that I've been talking about. Although again, it's not something that's unique to Quakers, but it is central to my approach. It implies that this group has, or at least strives for, a wholeness, even when they disagree. And the facilitator's role is to help to make this happen. So what is it that makes a community? And I'm going to share a definition of community by Parker Palmer, who is also a Quaker and a writer and a teacher and a leader. And he says, in a true community, we will not choose our companions, for our choices are so often limited by self-serving motives. Instead, our companions will be given to us by grace. Often, they will be persons who will upset our settled view of self and world. In fact, we might define true community as the place where the person you least want to live with always lives. And this is in a book that he wrote a number of years ago called The Promise of Paradox. And so that's my next theme, because for me, paradox is very important. And we can consider Parker-Palmer's definition of community and Frost's couplet as corollaries in a way, because it's having those people whom you least want to live with who make it possible to open to new ideas, new approaches. And so recognizing and embracing and living paradox, for me, is at the heart of my approach, as it is at the heart of life. And it's what ultimately makes the unity possible. And as was pointed out, unity is right there in community. And this dance requires everyone, including those we don't want to live with. So here's some other paradoxes that we might encounter while searching for the secret that's in the middle, and that will help us find them if we can find it, if we can resolve the paradox. So the first principle is, you must not fool yourself, and yet you are the easiest person to fool. And that's Richard Feynman, well-known physicist, mathematician, thinker. So that reminds me, I need to believe myself less. And then perhaps I can begin to trust and respect others more. And what happens if we go to that foundation of logic, mathematics? Well, here's what Bertrand Russell said about mathematics. Mathematics may be defined as the subject in which we never know what we're talking about, nor whether what we are saying is true. So this tells us logic alone is not enough. We are looking for truth. We are looking for feelings. We are looking for perception, intuition, all kinds of things that we won't find in that logic. So when we put all of this together, what I want to help people do, help the organization do, is have everyone recognize that I don't have all the answers. So that's the beginning of getting people open enough to listen to one another, to hear one another. So I am trying to help people to create the space where they can listen to the twin truths of their own paradox, but also of the other person's paradox, and their truth in relation to the other person's truth, and to break open, to begin to listen, to hear, and to reach in ultimately to the center of the circle that they've been dancing around, looking for the highest common denominator. Do we have some more questions at this point, or should I go on?
No, there was one about the tyranny of minorities as documented by de Tocqueville, I think you're touching on it. We're all facing it right now. I guess another question would be, how do you help them break open enough, as you're suggesting? We're very
Right.
polarized right now, and it's not easy to embrace that paradox.
Right. Well, that's the question. How do we get there? How do we need to include everybody's voices, and we need to hear everybody else's voices. Each person needs to hear everyone else's voice. And how do we do that? So that's our next step. So to hear everybody's voices, we need trust, we need respect, we need to listen, and then we can begin to speak. And when we speak, the principle of speaking is each person speaks their own truth rather than denying someone else's truth.
Yeah.
So you don't say, you're wrong. You say, this is what I believe.
Is it justified for the mediator or facilitator to substitute the word perception for truth?
Sure. I mean, as a mediator, I might do that. But I'm speaking here, I'm writing this from the perspective of the speaker. The speaker says, I'm speaking my truth.
Okay.
And the mediator, the facilitator, isn't judging it. So I'm not going to say that's not true. And I'm not really, probably not going to, in most cases, describe it. So I'm not going to say that's your perception either, because in a way that's saying, well, you're only thinking that, but it's not really true. So I'm going to start by building trust. So trust within the group is the issue. That's the first issue. It's the most important issue because that's what allows me to understand that what you said is your truth. Even if I don't agree with it, even if I think it's wrong, if I think it's only a perception or even not based on reality or whatever it may be, I have to respect you for stating it as your truth. And I have to respond, if I respond, not by nullifying it, but by stating my truth. And we'll say a little more about that. But here we're going to begin with trust building exercises, because trust is almost always the very first issue. It's when that trust has been lost that the group begins to have conflicts, difficulties, disagreements that they can't resolve. So how do we begin to create the trust that they're in good faith, even if I disagree with them? So there are a lot of trust building exercises. They may be in pairs or small group exercises where people relate stories to one another in ways that are designed to create trust. And I wish that we could do some of that, but of course we can't here, particularly with this large number of people and with people on Zoom. So I'll have to forego that. But even something like seat changing games, things that people will perceive and feel as we're just playing a game, but really have an effect on the dynamics of the group. I had one group where the organization, the directors of the organization, had such bad conflict that they had not been able to have a regular meeting for 2 years. And so I came in and they had a meeting. They all came together for this session. And they sat around in a circle, and each person there put their briefcase or bag or whatever they had down next to their chair. And it was pretty clear from watching the dynamics. Each person was next to the person they knew best, trusted best. And so the first thing to do was, how can I change the dynamic? And so I did just a seat changing game. It wasn't an elimination game like musical chairs, but just where at a certain point, everybody had to get up and take a different seat. And everybody left the bags where they were. And they got up and they changed seats, and then we stirred it up again, and we stirred it up again until everybody was sitting in a new place. And then when the game was over, they started to get up and go back to their seats next to their friends. And I said, no, let's just stay here for a while. And that changed the whole dynamic of the group. And it was the first beginning of a process that took a number of sessions over many months. But it was an important beginning because they had to learn to tolerate sitting next to somebody who was not their friend and might in fact have been somebody that they really had a real disagreement with. Mm-hmm. And an extreme example, extremely amazing example, is a blind walk where, and this has been used in situations in Rwanda. So I don't know if you know what a blind walk or a trust walk is, but you put a blindfold on, you put your hand on the shoulder of the person in front of you who is not blindfolded. And that person leads you across an obstacle course. So you have to really trust that person to go on that kind of a walk. And there's an organization in Africa, or it has a program called Healing and Restoring Our Communities, HROC or HIROC. And they have used this after probably a week of workshops with the other kinds of exercises I've been talking about. But imagine doing a trust walk where the person whose shoulder your hand is resting on might be somebody who killed your grandmother. And yet that's what they are able to do. So these exercises can be very, very powerful in restoring community. So that's one piece. That's the first piece, building trust.
So there is a question that you might want to touch on.
Okay. Can you speak a little louder, Julie, or get a little closer?
I'm sorry, I have a sound issue.
Sure.
What happens when there's a genuine power imbalance in the group? You talked about serious disputes, but power imbalance, supervisor and employee, when you're doing these trust exercises, particularly the blind walk.
Well, the blind walk, again, you don't do that until you've got the trust. Okay. In a way, that is an exercise that demonstrates visibly to everybody the trust that has been established. So it confirms, I would say, more often than establishes trust. In terms of supervisors and non-supervisors, that can be a difficult issue. You would have to address that at the beginning by getting everybody to agree that in this configuration, there are no supervisors and no employees because we're creating a group here, a community. And again, that depends on the circumstances. But that's really the premise of this approach, is that everybody has to be willing to say, I'm a participant like everybody else. I don't have a louder voice than you do. You don't have a louder voice than I do. So there may be situations in which a very different approach would have to be taken. But that's what I would say about that. There's no absolute answer, obviously.
Okay. How has Zoom affected this practice? Not easy to do trust exercises on screens.
Well, I will say that the exercises, I've worked very hard to find exercises that work on Zoom. I haven't done a lot. I have done a little bit on Zoom, and I have some exercises that work. But I have to say there was a period of time where I wasn't really working, and that's been a lot of this last couple of years since I moved to California and dealt with some health issues and other things. So I've given a lot of thought to it. I have had success doing it, but I'm not sure I want to say too much more than that at this point.
You haven't got an example you could give us?
Well,
I mean, if you don't want to, then you don't want to.
Yeah, I mean, I can say, I'm not sure that I have an example where Zoom made the difference. All I can say is I have done this on Zoom, and it has had some success. And to a certain extent, I'm still feeling my way with it, but I'm feeling more confident as I do more of it.
And there's okay.
I can't give a story where I can say, this is a demonstration of Zoom as distinct from in person. But it has certainly affected the exercises that I can do. And I've had to pull out a lot of exercises. For instance, there's a form of exercise called concentric circles, in which one group of people is in a circle facing out, and another group is facing in. And so you have an exchange on a topic, the two people facing each other, and then one of the circles moves one person either clockwise or counterclockwise, and you have another set of questions that the people exchange about with the new person that they're facing. Obviously, you can't do that on Zoom. So there are things that don't work. There are other things, working in pairs, where you have that kind of an exchange, and they can be very powerful, and that does work on Zoom because it's just a given pair, and then if you redo it with a different question, you just scramble and have a new set of pairs. But it's not the same kind of form as the concentric circle.
Okay, we have another here. What happens when there is trust, when the trust has been broken and people feel disrespected from things that have happened in the past, and both sides have kind of grabbed a hold of their positions and are not ready to move? How do you dislodge them?
Well, again, yeah, that's exactly the situation with the organization that I was talking about before. And let me see if I can skip ahead to something. So in that kind of a situation, that may actually call for forgiveness, and that can be looked at as a religious practice, but it doesn't have to be. But this is one of the approaches in that kind of situation, and was one of the things that I did in the organization that I was talking about before, where people were not able to talk to each other, had not been able to talk for years, literally. And at the beginning, were only willing to sit next to the people that they trusted from their side of the issue. And in the end, one of the things that I had to do was to bring some exercises in forgiveness. And there's many ways of approaching that, and that would be a whole session on itself. And maybe one of these days I'll bring that here. I don't know, but it would be going too far afield to go into detail. But I will say what I say here, that you bring what is useful, and in this organization, which was kind of a religiously based or oriented organization, not Quaker, I had to bring it in a theology that wasn't mine, but was appropriate for those people, because they would hear forgiveness best in a theological context. But there are also non-theological contexts. But it's work, however you phrase it, for release from the past, for helping people let go of the anger that they have continued to carry from the past. That doesn't mean that whatever happened didn't happen. It had its results. You know, there's a Buddhist story of two monks coming to a stream, and there's a woman looking at the stream and is clearly afraid to cross. And one of the monks picks up the woman, puts her on his shoulders, and the two monks cross the river, put down the woman, and the monks continue on their way, and the woman goes on her own way. And about half an hour later, one monk says to the other, you know, it's forbidden for us to touch women. How could you carry that woman across the river? And the other monk says, oh, are you still carrying that woman? I put her down half an hour ago. So that's what we're talking about here.
Okay, one more here. How do you
Sure.
support the person something troubling was said to? If the group disperses, do you return to it at the end of a break? It's a little, I'm not sure that's totally clear, but somebody says something nasty to someone else. It's sort of hovering in the room. You call a break, or it's the end of today's session. Do you, as the facilitator, return to that when they're next together?
You might not. I mean, it's hard to answer that kind of a question in the abstract.
Mm-hmm.
I would say if it occurs right at the end of the session, and it's clear that it's going to be important to address, I would say, let's postpone that break we were planning, or let's stay an extra 10 minutes because I think this needs to be addressed. So, you know, as a facilitator, you have to be nimble, and you can't always stick to what was the original plan. Like, it wasn't my original plan to talk about forgiveness at this point, but you have to be flexible and put it where it belongs.
Right.
So helping people listen, to come back to where I was. And forgiveness may need to come before people can listen. So, there is no fixed order here. If you're facilitating this kind of a discussion, as I say, you have to be nimble, you have to be flexible. You have to create space. Sometimes you won't call on the next person right away. You have to use all the mediator's tools that we know, depending on your framework, the way you've been used to using, reflecting, reframing, looping, whatever you want to call it. Ask questions, and then sometimes the break is what's needed. And especially listen for the place where someone says yes. So these are all intertwined: trust, respect, listening. And before, you had a downward spiral that brought the group into conflict, into disunity, disagreement. Now we establish trust, then we establish listening, then we come to respect. And so now we create an upward spiral that will support the group actually being able to find that place of unity.
Somebody's asking, what is looping?
I'm not going to get into mediation styles. That's a whole, I just put it out there. If you don't know it, this isn't about particular mediation techniques or ways of going back and finding out what people really mean.
Okay, but
Looping is
sort of
where
answered it, yeah.
you keep going back and forth with the same person until the person agrees that you've understood what they say. And that's one style of mediation. But I don't want to get into mediation styles.
Yeah, okay,
That's not today's topic.
that's fine. Loop, like reflecting, or yeah. Okay.
It's similar to reflecting. It's just a particular practice of a particular school of mediation. So
Great.
I threw it in for people from that school who might be watching also.
Sure. Onward.
Onward. Okay, so, I went in the wrong direction, that's why. So just a couple of final thoughts. These are a couple of things that were recently in the New York Times. Adam Grant, as I think he calls himself, a motivational psychologist. Preaching and prosecuting typically backfire. So that's saying, no, you're wrong, this is the truth. And so when you do that, what Adam Grant says is, much as a vaccine inoculates the physical system against a virus, the act of resistance against what somebody says fortifies the psychological immune system. Refuting a point of view produces, so to speak, antibodies against future attempts at influence. So then you're really just making the person more certain of their opinions, which comes back to what Feynman said about the easiest person to fool. And in order to avoid that, you don't disagree, which is part of this process of finding unity by affirming what I say rather than attacking what you say. I don't resist what you say. I acknowledge that is your genuine view. That is your truth. I can ask about it, or maybe better, the facilitator can ask about it rather than somebody who disagrees. This is not a system of dialogue, or that is direct dialogue between two people who disagree. So if something is unclear, the facilitator can ask questions that will bring out more about it so that people can hear one another. And then here is one final story, which some of you may have seen. I love the title, Getting to Yes. Some of us have seen that title before. But this is about a nursing home supervisor. And she said almost half the staff in her home didn't want to be vaccinated. And she tried various things, but she realized you really have to listen to each person's story and address it from that standpoint so that they feel this is a workplace that cares about me. We're doing this because we care. So that's about respect, listening and respect. So this is interaction between the director and the staff. It's not so much a whole group, although she did some things in the whole group. But it's just, again, underlining the importance of listening and respect. And also about asking. She says, instead of, or the reporter says, now instead of continuing to load people with facts, she focused on asking them, what information do you need? What is your concern? So that's very closely related to what Adam Grant said. She isn't trying to refute what they believe. She's asking them, what is it that you need to hear to understand? And she actually got more than half of those people, just in a couple of months, who had said, no, I'm never going to take this vaccine, or at least we're resisting taking it. Ultimately, more than half of those non-vaccinator people agreed to take the vaccine. And the vaccine team only came around once a month for 3 months. So after the first time when she discovered that almost half the staff was saying no, and 2 more opportunities, she got well over 75% of the staff vaccinated. So I thought that was an interesting story and a good note to end on. For people who really want to know more about the Quaker process, here's a couple of books you can look at, or one book, Beyond Majority Rule, and a wonderful little pamphlet written for Quakers specifically, so it'll be very Quaker language, Beyond Consensus. And you can get those from Pendle Hill, which is a Quaker conference center and bookstore. If you want to go to a Quaker meeting and experience firsthand a Quaker meeting and Quaker process, go to Quaker Finder. And if you want to reach me, I'm at thomasrothschild.com, and I have a contact me page there. And with that, thank you for joining today's discussion. It's been a pleasure to be with you, and we'll continue with questions or discussions or whatever people have.
There are a lot of links that have been posted on the on the chat section as well. Tom, I think, unless I see some more, there aren't any more questions. We stuck them all in the middle and admonished me for interrupting, which I understand. But you managed to answer them all.
Excuse me, I did have a question.
Sure.
Great.
Okay, I posted it about midway through or 2/3 of the way through, Tom. Hi, I'm Kathy Orchin, and I has been very seeped in Quaker process for quite some time. You had mentioned something to the effect that the person needs to step out of their own position, or almost like step out of their own ego. I heard it in that regard. And that's a huge step for a person to make, particularly in this society where we're raised so highly, committed to our egos and our positions. Can you discuss that a little further? That's a really deep transformational point for people to make.
Well, I don't want to overstate that. They have to be willing to step out enough to hear the other person. I'm not saying they step out of their position or their belief. That's what they're offering to the group, but they have to offer it without being attached in the sense that it must be the way that I want it. They have to be willing to listen. And I think that's at the heart of the Quaker process. As we said in the first story, it is about building community. And building community means it's not just me. Building community is all of us together. And that doesn't mean I'm no longer who I am. I'm still who I am. And I want you to respect who I am. So in that sense, I'm not asked to do more than you are. And I'm not asked to become somebody else, certainly. But I am asked to listen in a new way. Is that helpful?
Definitely beautifully stated. Thank you so very much. Yes.
Sure.
Tom, could you shut out your screen share and we can see the full?
Yes,
array
let's,
of
I think we're time to stop the sharing.
there, and then you come up and
And
so does everybody else. So great. And okay, is it possible to mediate without adopting a give and take approach? Well, you said you didn't necessarily want to get into mediation, but that's a question that's cropped up.
hold on a second, let me turn my volume up a little. I'm a little unclear. What is the question again, Julie?
Yeah, it is. Is it really possible to mediate without adopting a give and take approach? I can't say more than that. Maybe the person, Kishore Deer, might want to qualify what was meant. But that person may no longer be with us.
No, I'm very much here.
There
You see
you
my
are.
point? Yeah.
Yes.
So you see whole you see the concern is unlike you see the litigation or arbitration, the mediation can succeed. You see only if you see because just now there was talk of ego. So that's why I'm saying that you see unless the people you see become little less adversarial and are willing to listen to others, understand others' concerns, share their viewpoints, and subordinate.
Slow down, Kishore, slow down. It's
Okay.
Yeah, I think hopefully I've got the gist of it.
okay.
Oh yeah.
Again, I'm not typically talking about a mediation between two parties, like a formal commercial mediation or divorce mediation. I'm talking about a group. And so there are different stages. When we're building trust and doing exercises, there will certainly be exchanges. But it's not like we're trying to reach agreement on a particular point. We're trying to help the organization come together and find its direction. It may be that even that there isn't conflict in the organization, it's just reach a point where they have to find something new. I did something with a group not too long ago where they said, we've got all these assets, we've got all these projects, what are we going to do next? And they didn't feel they were in conflict at all, but they needed help in finding a way to move forward and decide what they wanted to do next. So I came in to help them with the beginning of that process. So sure, there's give and take, and at different stages, you do different things. So some of the exercises that I spoke about are full of give and take. Some of the process can be too, but the give and take in working towards the decision, again, we try to do it in this process. Ultimately, the people are going to go back and resume working as an organization in a different way. But for this particular kind of process, it is typically not a dialogue between the parties. First of all, you don't have parties, but it's not so much of a dialogue as each person speaking what they believe and listening. And that can become a dialogue if they can continue to speak and listen in the same way. But it depends on the situation. You know, if you're going to facilitate groups and organizations, you have to be very nimble. You have to be right there with the group, and you have to change what you thought you were doing 30 seconds ago. And I see my old friend Janice Tootie Jackson agreeing with me there. So, yeah.
Elon Bass from Italy is asking if you could comment on where your kind of unity decision-making processes are being employed and whether you're able to do it currently or just in the past, i.e., I guess he means pre-COVID.
Well, I would say with a certain degree of certainty that they're being employed by all Quaker meetings and churches quite regularly. And that includes doing it over Zoom. But those are people with a lot of experience, and that's a very different kind of a creature. Again, I had a fairly long break due to first the fact that I moved to California. I still miss New York and even the lousy bagels that we had at the breakfast. You know, it was a difficult move, uprooting myself from a lifetime, but I get to share a house with my daughter and son-in-law, so that's a good thing. That's why we moved here. And my granddaughter is nearby. But that and, oh, somebody's holding up a bagel for me to see. It's going to make me jealous. And then I had some illness and other things. So I have only recently really come back into doing this, but a couple of the examples that I used are from fairly recent times, but really only one of them that I've done recently has been on Zoom. So I can't speak to that too much.
There's a lot of applause in the background here. Lots
Oh,
of
thank you.
Great presentation. I want the slides, lots of those, Tom. And we'll make sure you see that too.
Sure, I will be glad to provide slides directly to anyone who wants them. And of course, the presentation will be posted.
So Julie, this is Vivian.
Vivian, yeah, Vivian wanted to speak.
Yes, Tom, I'm not a practicing mediator. I'm just a citizen of the world of New York or the Upper West Side, which is totally liberal, mostly. But I'm just I'm just talking as a citizen, you know, it's like, it is so hard to, what about if someone doesn't want to come to the table? Like I have a daughter who hasn't talked to me in 7 years. So, you know, it's like, it's, this is all well and good. The parties have to at least agree to talk, right? I mean, that's
Right.
the first step. You have to have at least parties who are willing to try. But if
Yes.
people are not willing to try, like in politics, and not willing to try, then like, how do you bear it? How do you do it? What do you do?
Well, again, I think you're right. The parties have to be willing. Now, in an organization, if you're part of an organization and the organization is going through this kind of a process, you're there and you maybe have less choice about whether you want to participate or not. In the world at large, you know, you're not going to be able to get everybody to participate. And certainly these days we're hearing stories of families where the children can't talk to the parents or to siblings or old friends, partners. And, you know, yes, it's frustrating because there is no way to force people to talk. And frankly, if you're forcing people to talk, it's not likely to be fruitful anyway. I mean, in my experience, if, you know, if somebody drags your sibling into a room where they have to face the camera and you, and I'm specifically saying sibling, not child, because I don't want to get into, you know, like your personal situation.
Yeah.
It's not really going to produce anything if the person didn't want to talk in the first place.
I know about Adam Grant's book. I mean, he thinks that you can engage, or is he saying that in case you do engage, this is the steps that you should take? Do you know what I mean?
Well, I haven't read his whole book, frankly. It's on my list now that I've read this article, and it is a great article. And I do want to read his book. And I'm very interested in all of the psychological, neurological questions, but it's not my area of expertise. But, you know, I would say the best I can say is if you've got somebody who's ready and willing and able to help mediate your situation, and you've got third parties who you can call on to help establish the contact, that's probably the best way to try to begin that sort of a discussion, dialogue, hopeful reconciliation, because you obviously can't do it directly.
If any more questions are out there, raise your hands and we can just call on you or unmute yourselves and speak.
Hey, Tom, Chris Kane.
Hi, Chris.
Enjoyed your discussion. And I guess I'm a little bit confused about consensus and what that's all about and where that might show up on the scale. I didn't, you know, equate it with lowest common denominator. So that's that sets me back a little bit in my thinking because I've been proposing consensus building, which I understood was near unanimity. But can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. Well, the difference between this process, and I kind of put them in their most stark, you know, opposition, if you will. They aren't necessarily that opposed to one another, but the idea behind it is different. Consensus building means finding something in effect. Consensus building has built into it a kind of a veto power. I guess that's how I would put it. That's the difference. So if I don't agree with something, part of the idea of consensus building is you want to move reasonably quickly. So if somebody says, I don't like that one, you put it aside. And if I don't like that one, you put that aside. And so you're left with something. Now, what you're left with is not necessarily bad, but it doesn't have the same kind of enthusiasm if you say, well, that one doesn't quite work, but it might help here. And that idea doesn't quite work, but it might help here. And you build something that's new. So that's what I would say is kind of the difference between consensus and unity.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thanks.
Sure.
Anything else? Anyone else?
Tom, hi, it's Robin Beckhart. Good to see you. Hi. I wondered about I'm thinking about a family as a community. This is something I put in the chat, and the question that was asked earlier about there being a lack of trust or respect because of past experiences. And I know you said that this of course has to do with some form of forgiveness, and that's a big other topic, but I just wondered if you could touch on it about how you might help a family start to address this when past issues and the implied or real lack of respect that led to them prevents the family from coming together. How would you help them start to find forgiveness or talk about it? I know it's a big question.
Yeah, again, forgiveness is a whole separate topic. I have a book on the way to forgiveness, which is this thick, but each page is an idea, so it's this big. And it's not my primary field, although I have certainly given some time to study it. And I think that there are many different paths to forgiveness. And so you have to start by meeting with the people, if possible, all together. But, you know, if at least everybody has to be committed to exploring the path. That's the first step.
Mm-hmm.
But then, you know, if they're committed to it, then you begin by starting to establish some kind of trust in the present. Mm-hmm. Again, like the organization that I was describing, there was something that had happened, something that had been said 2 years earlier that made it impossible for those people to talk to each other. But until we had done all the trust building and restoring that trust and respect, it wasn't possible to talk about forgiveness. And then, so how you do that, it seems if you're going to do a forgiveness project together with a group, like a family, you will still need to begin by restoring trust and respect. For me, that's always the beginning. And that's what makes it possible. But the other thing about forgiveness is the recognition that what occurred has occurred. It's had its effects. My personal story, and it's not a personal experience, but a kind of a story that I use for an illustration is, I go to my grandmother's house and I play ball in the living room, which is absolutely forbidden. And in the process, I break my grandmother's favorite vase. So I say, I'm sorry. I say, forgive me. And, you know, that's my grandmother. My grandmother is going to forgive me. But the vase remains broken. I can't change what happened or the effects of it. But with the forgiveness, my grandmother is able to let go of her anger. And that forms the basis for restoring the relationship. So maybe that's helpful.
It is, thank you.
I wanted to ask, it's Maria.
Yeah.
This feels like it could be a very time-consuming undertaking. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the amount of time, and I know that this obviously varies from situation to situation, but
Sure.
We live in a very time-conscious society, and this feels like one really has to invest considerable amount of time. So I'm just wondering if you could talk about that dimension that goes into this process.
It depends on the circumstances, Maria, because in that group that I was talking about with the forgiveness that hadn't been able to meet for 2 years, so that's kind of one extreme, that was very deep. And yes, it takes a lot of time, but it was essential to the survival of the organization. So if it's essential to the survival of the organization, and you really want, whatever you may feel about the person whom you hurt or who hurt you, you're going to commit that time. And that was a series of weekends, not weekends in a row, separated by months, but it took a number of weekend sessions to get to that place where finally they can say, yes, we can function now. And now we can write our own bylaws. You don't have to help us. New bylaws to reflect what we've learned.
And
on
how
the other hand,
long those sessions?
They were Friday evening through Sunday noon at a retreat center. And there were 3 or 4 or 5, I don't remember exactly, I think 3 or 4 such sessions over a period of time. On the other hand, there was another organization that I worked with that was doing a housing project, and I was called in suddenly when the person they had been working with was not available. And I spent a day with them. And it turned out that they had some trust issues and other issues. And we were able to work those through because basically the organization was sound in one day. So you can't put a number on that. It depends how serious it is. If it's an organization that is fully functional but is trying to find a new vision or grapple with a particular problem, that's a different kind of a situation. And again, depending on the scope, are they looking for a whole new vision for the organization? I had a situation like that where one organization was reconfiguring into 2 entities, but the entities would still be interlocked. And that was very complicated. And I was involved ultimately in helping them figure out one piece of that puzzle. And that took a long, long time because it was very complicated and they had a history going back over a century. So, it's really hard to generalize. I don't see how one could.
When you're talking about the organization and meeting, could you give us some idea of how many people were involved?
In which kind of a situation? I mean, there are different numbers of people involved in different stories I told,
So. Give us a range. How about a range?
Yeah, well, say 10 to 150.
Yeah.
Is that a range?
Yeah.
Again, you can't generalize about that kind of a thing. Obviously, I use different approaches and different specific strategies and techniques for the group, depending on whether it's a small group, depending on whether they're trying to plan something, or whether they're trying to resolve conflict, or whether it's both at once or something else.
Right.
So it's as hard to generalize about the size as anything else. And it can be five or six groups together. Again, if it's a community thing, you know.
Tom, there's a lovely note here that I want to share with you. Thank you, Quakers and Tom. I have another meeting to go to. And thank you. Your talk was a good listen to the wisdom of Quakerism. Having been at the United Nations for many years, I can assert that the lowest common denominator was used to arrive at consensus, and the results were less than enthusiastic for the most part. But when unity was arrived at, such as for the Chemical Weapons Convention or nuclear test ban, which still left out a few, the excitement was palpable. I think you communicated that sense in your presentation. I'm delighted you're back here. I'm sure everyone else is too. Have a nice nap.
Thank you. And by the way, there is a Quaker presence at the United Nations, the Quaker UN office, which has an office in New York City and in Geneva. I've been there a number of times to their little townhouse. And they specialize in holding meetings privately for people who can't be seen meeting together. Among other things. And it's a very powerful but very quiet presence. So since the UN is mentioned, I will hold that up.
Maybe it's not surprising that people who can't be seen with each other are meeting in Switzerland.
Well, they meet in New York City also at Quaker House, as well as in Switzerland.
Thank you again, Tom. This has been absolutely wonderful. And if you could hang around for a few minutes, for those who would like to continue talking, we're happy to continue. But for now, we, as Julie said, have reached that magical 10 o'clock moment, and we are officially adjourned as the breakfast. But Tom, if you can hang around for just a bit for anyone who wants to chat.
If people want the slides and want to put their email in the chat or send them to you, Maria.
We'll post them also.
Yeah, and Nikki has already said that we will be emailing everyone who's registered for the breakfast, the slides and the recording, and we also post them. So yeah,
sure.
Thank you.
Sure, and I will send, Maria, should I send the slides to you or to Nikki or what?
Yeah, that's fine. And I will share with Nikki and our conveners of the breakfast.
Sure. So I will do that today.
Perfect.
Before that nap, as soon as I take a nap.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we're going to stop the recording for anyone who wants to stay on. We are now officially informal.